Hey, everybody. We're finally here. Sorry for the technical issues. We will stay late so that we can give you the full hour today. Apologize that we're about 17 minutes late getting going. I've got to answer Jay's icebreaker question before we get started about career prospects. No, I would not take a lucrative deal working for a porn site, but I would hire someone who had worked for one. I'm not going to judge their work history just as long as they could do the work. So I don't know if anybody cared, but I thought it was a good question. So let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who have not met me before, my name is Doug Brown. I have graduated from this course previously, actually within the same Grow with Google challenge that we're all doing right now. I finished it in 2.5 weeks. Which was absolutely crazy, but I had downtime at work, and so I took advantage of it. And so this has been a really great project, and the Udacity courses, I think, are a great opportunity to learn a lot of really fantastic skills that are tremendously beneficial in the workplace. As I said in the first session, I didn't know a lot of this material before we started the Grow with Google Challenge, and so I've been right in there with all of you, and I continue to monitor the Slack channels and try and help where I can. So similar to last time, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple things first before we get started. Get things to cooperate. There we go. So hopefully you can see my screen. So what I'm going to do is walk through today what my thoughts and approach were to finishing Project 2. And like I said in the first presentation, I'm going to encourage that you always begin at the beginning and remember that you don't need to deliver more than what the project is asking for, though there's a lot of opportunity to learn some new things along the way. So the steps that I went through on this project obviously were to first set up the REST server. Then I worked on getting ready to use IndexedDB because that's where a lot of the requirements really focus, are making sure that we can do stuff with the database and the REST services. Once I had that ready, then my next step was going to be to make the necessary updates to the service worker, because there's a lot that needs to happen in there now too. And then finally, I was going to check the Lighthouse scores and make sure that everything was, up to the metrics that are being asked for this particular project, for the PWA score being above 90, performance being above 70, and accessibility being above 90. But before we get into all of that, first I want to put in a couple of personal thoughts on this particular project. This was the hardest of the 3 projects for me to do. And a little bit of kind of UI philosophy from me about why it was hard. I really see the world of developers in 2 very distinct camps. You have backend developers, and they really enjoy doing the backend stuff. It's more procedural. It's very kind of cut and dry, results driven. I want to take a piece of data from point A, do some transforms on it, move it to point B, and as long as that works, everybody's generally pretty happy, as long as it's not taking a day to do it. And there really aren't a lot of subjective opinions when evaluating the code. It works or it doesn't. And most developers are pretty happy in that camp. Front-end development is a very different beast. There's a lot of creative thought that you have to deal with, not only being creative yourself in terms of getting the stuff on the screen to look the way that the designers want it to be looking like and that your customers are expecting. But because it is customer facing, because you have people who are looking at it and feeling it and touching it, it's a very emotional kind of outcome. And there are lots of subjective opinions involved here. People worry about, well, this is to the left by 2 pixels too many, or the color's a little too dark, or whatever. And you can wind up chasing those kinds of things for a long time. And you have to be very comfortable with that. Most of your backend developers are not comfortable with that at all. They completely hate that world. And then, of course, there is what a lot in the industry call full stack developers, and those are mythical unicorns. They don't actually exist, least in my opinion. But someone who claims to be a full stack developer is generally going to be a back-end developer who has crossed over and has done some front-end development because it makes them more marketable. I've gone the other direction a couple times where I've never claimed to be a full stack developer, but I've spent my career being all about the front end. And in a few cases, I have, crossed over a bit and done some back end work. It's just not where my passions are. And generally that's where it comes down, is what are your passions and what do you enjoy doing? People who enjoy doing the back end work really have no passion for the front end, and vice versa. If you try and make me do back end work, it's going to kind of stress me out a little bit. That being said, that's why this particular project was by far the hardest one for me out of this course. And as we get into it more, we'll talk about why. So where I started here was with the REST server. It is a standalone project. You're going to download it separately. You're going to run it separately. I'll show you that here in another window in a second. You're not going to want to modify this at all. I've seen a few mentions on the Slack channels about people making some changes to it because of some data or this or that. This is really kind of a taste of the real world. When you get out there working on a larger scale project, you are not necessarily going to have the option to have people modify your data source or the backend server. You're just going to have to deal with whatever it's giving you. And so this is a good opportunity to practice that a bit. Not to mention, too, when you submit it for review, the reviewers aren't looking to have to download a modified version of the server as well. Really, once you've got the server installed, there are only some minor code updates in the web app that you're going to need to do to actually get the restaurants showing up again. So let's take a look real quick at what I did with that. So again, I'm going to be using Beyond Compare so that we can look at some code, kind of how I did some things versus what we had already. Again, this is how I did things. It's not how you need to do things or how it should be done. A lot of things can be done different ways. So these are just going to be my approach and how it worked. So this is the server download. And really just pull the package or the repo down, put it in a separate folder, look at the README. You don't really have to touch anything in here. Just follow the steps of the README. So pull it down, run npm install, and then just like it says, you're going to want to run node server. And so I've already got it running here, and it tells me that I'm running the development environment on port 1337. Once you've got that, just put it away and don't look at it anymore because it's going to be there doing exactly what it needs to do. The changes that we need to make to start getting the information out of this server are in the DB helper file. And really, they are fairly small. So you can see here, we had a port before of port 8000 that we were using to get the data, and we were pulling in specifically this restaurant's JSON file. All I've done here is I've changed it to port 1337, and now all I'm doing is pulling from restaurants. That basic change is going to get back the exact same data I was getting from the restaurant's JSON before. And that, if I did nothing else to this file, should start getting me the restaurant display. Now, I do make a couple of other changes in here because learning about the XHR stuff in Project 1 was all well and good, but XHR kind of stinks on ice. And so I would recommend highly that you get rid of it. I left it commented here just so you can see where I took it out. And I would replace it with fetch. Fetch is a lot simpler to use, a lot fewer hoops to jump through. I'm sure a lot of you have already made this change. You can see that I've got the database helper URL. I'm getting that into my fetch. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but I've sort of modified this here. You'll see that this call for fetch restaurants takes an ID parameter as well. And then I'm checking to see if it has anything in it. And if it doesn't, I'm just getting the basic call out to get my full list of restaurants. If it does have an ID in it, then I'm making the call, I'm making my URL have the ID on it as well. And then I'm doing the fetch and dealing with it from there. we'll get a little deeper into some of that when we start talking about exactly how we're handling the web service and doing all the caching and all those things. But the important bit to know here is which URL I'm pulling from is the only thing really that makes a difference between whether I am getting the full list of restaurants or just the single restaurant that I want the details for. Okay, so going back to here, once we've got that part done, then the next bit is to get ready for using IndexedDB. This is the part of the course that explains why we can't have nice things like React. I've seen people on the Slack channels saying, well, can I just use React? Believe me, if I could have just used React, I would have just used React, because it allows us to do the one thing that we need to be able to do here really easily because it's already built in. But that's what they want us to learn, so we don't get to. So you're going to choose a build tool and framework. Yeoman is the thing that they have in the course, and it is what I used because I was trying to go with the course. But really, some of the guys who work for me at the office, they really recommend using Webpack. A lot of other people use Webpack. It's newer than Yeoman. By all accounts, some of the things that we need to do here are going to be more straightforward if you just go that route. So I would encourage looking at Webpack rather than Yeoman. All of this is going to be done really so that we can write one line of code in the service worker and have it work. There are other things that we can do with our build tool, but this is the one thing we really need it for from the rubric. And when we get to the service worker, we'll get to that, but it is the import line. Don't get caught up in doing things that you don't need to do with this. Like this is going to create a distribution folder. There's nothing in the rubric that says that you have to have a completely sane final distributable being pushed out by your build file. So I didn't do that. I let that go because I had enough of a headache just getting everything that I wanted to get done in here done. So let's take a look real quick, and I'll show you kind of where this starts. So I'm using Beyond Compare. Let me switch this back here. You'll notice that right now I'm comparing what looks like the same set of files and folders with some differences. But if you notice, what I'm really comparing is the app folder under this new version versus just the basic root folder from what I had done in Project 1. If I go back and I compare the actual root folder from both versions, they're very different. And the reason for this is because I have all of the Yeoman stuff in here now, not over here. So here's all my CSS, data, images, blah, blah, blah. All those things are over here. All of that stuff is now inside of the app folder. All I did to get to this state was I created a new Yeoman project in a completely separate folder. Once that was all stood up and ready to go, I took all of my code files from here, my CSS, data, images, JS, index, and restaurant file, and my service worker file, and I put them all inside the app folder. By default, a build tool like this is going to generally create something like an app folder and maybe a test folder, distribution folder. And the app folder is going to be where the build tool is pulling from to get all of the source material to generate your test file and your test folder and your distribution folder. So it's not too hard to get this basic structure set up. And then once you do, the thing that you're going to be spending a lot of time with then is, in the case of Yeoman, and I think also with Webpack, is your gulp file. This gulp file obviously does not exist in my previous version of the project. The gulp file really has a lot of stuff in here. You can see it covers quite a bit of ground. A lot of it is boilerplate, comes right out of the package from Yeoman. I'm going to run over a few things here to show you what I had to change. And again, this works. It does what I need it to do. I am sure that there are plenty of people out there who could tell me how to do this better. But it got me through the project, and that's what I was shooting for. So one of the things that the Yeoman package doesn't include is Browserify. And Browserify is the piece that's really necessary to be able to get our import statement and our service worker to work so that we can include IndexedDB. Babelify is in here. There are a few other plugins that I wound up messing around with and having to get in to make sure that stuff was going to work right. I don't remember, Vinyl was one of them. I don't remember if there are any others, but definitely Browserify, Babelify, and Vinyl. By default, there are going to be a bunch of tasks already here. So like the CSS task is going to go into the CSS folder. It's going to read everything, and it's going to dump it back out into my temp folder. So the .temp, we go back in here and look. I don't see where it is. The .temp folder is where all of the files are going to go to actually do our testing, our actual live looking at the site. Same thing with our JS files. It's going to put them all in there. The one that I really had to spend time figuring out to get just right was the service worker file. This task did not exist with the static or out-of-the-box Yeoman instance. So I had to write this one in because we have a service worker file that doesn't live within the JavaScript folder, and nothing else in the default Yeoman configuration is using Browserify to get us to be able to do an import for JavaScript. And that's what we need to do for the service worker. So here I did all the work to create the Browserify instance, and then using the Browserify instance to Babelify this particular file, the SWJS file, bundle it up, and then pipe it back out so that it went into the temp file. Took me a bit to figure this one out because I've never done anything like this before. And like I said, I'm a front-end guy, not a back-end guy. And from an enterprise development standpoint, this is really what you would usually look at as a build engineer task, which is definitely more of a back-end role. And so this is not an area that I have typically dealt with before. The lint is something that comes default. And then this gulp task for the HTML was in here. But again, I made some modifications just to include the service worker task. Here you can see it's actually pushing stuff out to the distribution folder. This doesn't actually quite work completely. But again, we're not looking to be able to create distribution images. We just want to be able to look at our files as they're loading. And that's what we're going to be evaluated on. Same thing with the images folder. It's running through and checking everything here and pushing it to the distribution folder. Our icons, similar thing, fonts, and any of our extras. The node or the serve, when we do the gulp serve on our new web page with this setup, this is what's going to get run. And so you can see it's going to go through and run all of the CSS, JS, service worker, and fonts tasks. It's going to put everything or look for everything to be in the temp and app folders. And it's going to watch for changes in any of those files so that it knows to rerun the server if we make changes. So this is where the live reload happens while we're doing development. And then again, serve from distribution folder and serve from test folder, we don't really need to worry about here. We're not doing those here. And then a few other tasks as well. You know, like the wire dep. I don't think I had to make any adjustments to this one. I didn't touch the build, the build task. So that's the gist of what you have to do in here. Again, it's what I did to make sure that I could get it working to the point that I needed it to be to pass the project. Webpack, I believe, from everything I understand about it, would be a little more straightforward, though a lot of it's going to be similar because it's still gulp. So those are the things that I would recommend watching out for and being aware of. Okay, so the next step then is we need to update the service worker. From everything that you've gone through in the Grow with Google course, all of that stuff is going to be directly applicable here when it comes to using IndexedDB. Nothing really too far afield. There is one extra piece in here that I did a little beyond what you would see in the course material, and that is to handle the service worker, have it handle the calls for AJAX sources, our JSON calls to the REST server, have it deal with those separately and differently from our standard requests for HTML files and images and so on. So we'll go back to Beyond Compare again. And if you look at the service worker file, you'll see that the first thing I've done in here is my import IDB from IDB. All of that work that we did with Yeoman or Webpack or whatever, it's just so we can get that line to work without having the build scripts running. When we try and do a DB promise and IDB open, everything's just going to break. This whole import statement is going to break. Nothing's going to work right. If you go and look at the compiled code, you will see some pretty complicated looking JavaScript that comes out of this import statement, which is pulling in this entire IDB library and making it accessible to what we're doing in the service worker. So here I've set my cache ID still the same as I had before. I am creating an instance of the IndexedDB. I'm opening my FM Udacity restaurant, FM for Finite Monkey. Some of you have noticed that my repo is the Finite Monkey. I used to have my own company years ago, and so I've used that moniker ever since because that was the company name. So here I've got version 1 of my index database, and if it does get upgraded, then this is a switch statement to deal with what we need to do. Here in this case, all I'm doing is creating an object store called restaurants. It has a key path of ID. There's really nothing more that needs to be done for this round to make all of this work appropriately. Then still I've got my, my event listener for installing the service worker. The only thing that I've changed here is now instead of caching my restaurants JSON and the JavaScript folder, I've taken that out because I'm not going to have that file anymore. So that's not going to be useful. Everything else stays the same. Everything to a point in my fetch listener is staying the same. You can see before, I was just looking, and if it was a local host, then I was responding with getting that file. And I'm still going to do that. I'm not changing any of that code. But what I am doing is adding in that split that I talked about. So what I'm doing first is I'm looking at the URL for the request, and I'm checking to see if the port for that URL is 1337, because I know that that's where the REST servers or service requests are going. And if it's a 1337 port request, then what I'm doing is I'm splitting the path name, and I'm looking to see if the last piece of the path name is restaurants. If it is, I'm just going to say that I'm using this index of -1. And that's the index that I'll use to store the results of this request in the IndexedDB. Otherwise, what I'll do is take the last piece of this path name, which will be the number for the restaurant, and that's what will become the ID. And I'll use that for storing it in the database as well. I did see someone in the chat window before we started, while we were working on getting the technical issues straightened out, saying that they were having some problems with retrieving things back out of the database once they've put them in. I'll be honest and tell you, I ran into a little bit of that too. And the reason for it is that if you use a string identifier to store your piece of information in the IndexedDB, but then try and use an actual numeric version of that string to retrieve it, it won't find it because they don't match anymore. And vice versa as well. If you've used an integer identifier and you use the string version to try and retrieve it, those won't match either. So you need to make sure that however you're storing and retrieving them, that it's the same on both sides. So you can see in this case, I've had this be a string, which is fine. On the other ones, they might be a number, also fine. They just have to match. Whatever you stored in has to be however you're trying to retrieve it. So just double check and make sure that you're doing that, and you should be able to get your data back out. So here, if I am in port 1337, I'm splitting it. I'm making sure what my index is going to be, and then I'm calling handle AJAX event. Otherwise, if it's on anything besides port 1337, then I'm doing a non-AJAX event, which is going to call all the code that I had from the first project. None of that's going to change. So handling my AJAX event is where things get different. Here, I am making the call and I'm responding, first checking the database, getting my database instance, doing the transaction, getting the store and the ID, and looking for the data inside of that. If the data is there, then I'll return that. If it's not, then what I'll do is do a fetch to get that data from the server, take the JSON that comes back on that request, put it into the database, return the promise from that. And so the database then is storing the information that came out of my request using the ID that I set and the data that comes back on the request. And that is then also returning the JSON back up all the way through the chain so that it eventually winds up coming back out on that fetch. The fetch then chaining can get a little tricky sometimes. So you just have to make sure that the order of operations are completely right. And this is where I've wound up spending a little bit of time on a couple things too, because you know, I get the event chain looks like it's right, but I've got something nested in, you know, the wrong spot. And so it's not actually returning all the way back out. You have to make sure that this is actually returning back up to here, which is then returning back up to here, so that it returns all the way back out to here. It can get a little deep. You just have to be careful with it and it'll work fine. Once that returns back out, once this has all happened, then the final response gets sent and the JSON is stringified out so that it goes back out to the original call and can be handled from there. Everything else here, like I said before, is exactly the same as it was in the first project, except I'm calling it in a separate function and then running it exactly the way as I had before. And again, like in the first project, there's just some pretty formatting happening here. The code itself hasn't changed. It's strictly a difference in formatting. All right, so with all of that done, what you should see now is as you make the calls or as you navigate the restaurants, and then if you go offline, everything should still be in there. And if you go into your application inspector in Chrome and look at the contents of the IndexedDB, you should see all of the data in there as well. Okay, so our final step is going to be to check our Lighthouse scores. Once I was done with everything, these were my Lighthouse scores for Project 2. Now, there were a few things that weren't quite this high when I first started, when I did my first Lighthouse check. The really nice thing about Lighthouse is that you can go in and look at all of the different opportunities that you have to improve things here. So you can see that it's telling me that I could, you know, be a little better with my off-screen images, and I could improve on render blocking style sheets and so on. I expect that I'll be doing a Project 3 webinar, and when we do, we can talk about some of these things. I'll give you a spoiler and tell you that I spent a lot of time on a couple of these things, and in the end wound up not doing anything with them because that wasn't what was holding me back. For Progressive Web App, there were a number of things in here originally that were getting flagged and that did need to be done. There wasn't too much by way of accessibility. I think it had a couple other things in here that I did fix. If we look for the Progressive Web App portion of things, though, you'll see that one of the biggest areas was I needed to create this manifest.json where I could include all of the information that a progressive web app would need to be able to live on the home screen on an Android device. So short name, name of the application, some source icons, which I created and put into these folders within the application space, which URL it starts off, setting some theme colors, and how I wanted to display it as full screen. Some of these things also then needed to go into the files themselves. So you can see I added in the theme color and where the manifest file is located. It wasn't really much more than that, though, to get the score up above 90. And so that wasn't very difficult. Somewhere along the way, from a performance standpoint, though, I did make some changes, and I saw, and I don't have them, they were back in Project 1, I think. So if you want to, you can go and look in the repo and compare it to the original project files we got. But I did see someone ask on one of the Slack channels earlier this week if it was okay to make modifications to the JavaScript because it looked like some of these functions were getting called 3 times and it seemed repetitive and unnecessary. And yes, it was doing that. Yes, it is repetitive, it is unnecessary, and it does drag your performance score down. Do refactor your code a bit to get rid of those things. If we go back and we look in main, it was in the main and in the restaurant info.js files where some of those things were happening, where things like, I think it was fetch neighborhoods or fetch restaurants were being called multiple times over. They were like referencing each other and forcing each other to call a couple of times. Honestly, it's the sort of mistake that generally I think they did on purpose, just to make us find it. But again, I didn't really touch these files for this project. Prettier formatting on a few things, but other than that, functionally, they are largely identical. Nothing about them has really changed at all. A little bit of difference in how I'm handling my image building in this case, the base URLs and how I'm doing the single density or double density versions. But other than that, I didn't really touch much between version 1 and version 2 on this project. So the primary differences are going to be a bit of work in your DB helper file, a lot of work in your service worker file, a lot of work making a brand new gulp file, and a little bit of work adding a manifest JSON. And that should get you to where you need to be. The final version, for me, still looks exactly the same as my original version, except that now everything is going through the server on the back end, and it's pulling all of the data and then storing it in the IndexedDB. So if I take it offline, everything will continue to show up from there. Okay, so at that point, with that, I think we're ready to do some Q&A. I am putting my GitHub repo info up here on the screen so that if you want to go and look, these slides are already loaded up there. Again, the code repository is up there if you want to take a look at how I did some of these things. Again, play fair. You know, it's good to use other folks as reference, but do make sure you're working through the problem and understanding how it's working so you can implement it yourself. Yeah, so we're ready to take some Q&A. I know Kelsey has been working on keeping some questions going for me. Okay, so the changes in the Yeoman script that I created. I don't have the original Yeoman script that it created. I'm just going to be forthright about that here. But most of this is still the boilerplate. The service worker portion, this I created completely from scratch so that I could get the service worker edited in. There were a few other touches in here. Like I said, adding the service worker as a task, as a subtask for some of these other tasks. That's the thing to get your head around with how gulp works. You can create a task. Here's the task name. Here's all the subtasks that it's going to run. So it's running CSS, JS, service worker. So once you create the task, you just need to make sure that you're calling it from the other places that it needs to be. Okay, another question on Canary and Lighthouse, saying that Canary and Lighthouse worked better for them than standard Chrome and Lighthouse. You shouldn't have to use Canary at this point. All of the tools that you need to get through this project are available in standard Chrome. And as a matter of fact, if you look, that's all I'm using here is standard Chrome, and it's got Lighthouse running in here just fine. Matter of fact, I've even got an update this morning that's ready to go. So I'll be doing that later today. But no, you don't need Canary. Okay, so the purpose of a manifest file, another good question. So I'll go back here to the manifest file. When you're creating a progressive web app, a PWA, the purpose of a progressive web app is I can take a website like the restaurant reviews site and actually have an icon for it on my home screen on Android. So all the Android devices out there, tablets, phones, whatever, they could look like they have an app launcher icon on the home screen. I think iOS applications can do, or iOS can do it as well. But I'm really an Android guy, so I'm more familiar with that space. And so the manifest JSON file is putting out all of the information that the operating system and browser need to have to know how to create that look for that PWA. So here's the short name that would appear on my home screen underneath my icon, and here's the full name of the application. And these are the icons. So kind of single density, double density, triple density, quadruple density, depending on what device I'm on and how big the icon is set to be in the accessibility settings on the operating system. What URL for the website is going to open up, what I want the background color of the website itself, of the page to be, of the web browser to be, and what the theme color is overall. And then this full screen says, display this web application full screen so it looks like a regular app. And so the user is not going to see all of the browser Chrome and other things that they would typically see. So, unless the user knows they're actually running in a web browser, if this is done well, for the most part, it should feel and look a lot like a standard application. Okay, so where did I find the manifest file? And the documentation has zero boilerplate. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think all I did was I did a Google search for PWA manifest JSON, and I found Google's website, because Google is the main driver for progressive web apps. They're the ones who have really pushed the standard for it. And so they have documentation there. And they had some basic boilerplate, and they kind of ran through what the parameters are that you can put in. And I just ran with it from there and kind of pieced it all together. Okay, so another question. Where do we learn gulp, Yeoman, Webpack, Browserify, etc.? Okay, that is a great question. It doesn't have a great answer. Like I said, this was the hardest part of the entire project for me, and it was the hardest part of the entire course. I spent hours going through and doing Google searches and crawling through websites with examples of how to write Yeoman scripts and gulp scripts, and looking for what packages were necessary to be able to do an import statement to get IDB imported into the file for the service worker. Literally hours. When I say that, and again, when I say that I got this done in a very short period of time, in terms of number of days, it was short, but in terms of number of hours, I spent a fair bit of time on this. I really did have a period of time with some downtime at the office, and I think I probably spent 3 or 4 full days on getting just this done. And I'm talking like full office days. So, you can expect to spend a little bit of time in here doing the research, finding the pieces you need. Just make sure you leave yourself enough time. This is the part that's going to take the longest to get through for most everybody. So, as far as references to Yeoman and so on, Grunt's introduced in the lessons. I think a little later in the lessons, or at one point in the discussion about Grunt, they mention that it's good to use some prefabricated frameworks like Yeoman or Webpack, and they go over Yeoman a bit, and so that's where I grabbed that one. Again, Yeoman's website has some basic documentation. It assumes a lot of knowledge. It really does. Same with Gulp. Gulp has documentation. But as you can see from this, to really make any of these systems work, you're going to go out and you're going to pull in a lot of other packages. Gulp, Gulp load plugins, Browserify, Babelify, Vinyl, Browser Sync. All of these things are not like built into Gulp or Grunt or anything else. They're add-ons that other people are writing and maintaining. And so you're going to have to go out and search for, basically I was putting in Google searches saying, hey, this is the thing that I want to do. I want to import the IDB library into a JavaScript file. How do I do that using Gulp? And I spent a lot of time chasing different conversations and threads to find the pieces and parts that I needed. There are some repositories out there that will tell you these are the Gulp extensions that people use and what they do, and you just have to kind of crawl through those things. Okay, another good question. How should the map be handled in offline mode? That's a fair question. There isn't really a requirement one way or the other in here that I've been able to see. I've definitely seen the conversations on the Slack channel about how if you're caching the map data, it definitely bloats up the cache pretty quickly. There's not a requirement that says do or don't. And so I just left it on as caching. And nobody really complained about that. So, do whatever would work best for you, I would say. Okay, question 4, why Yeoman and not Grunt? So with like a lot of things, and this goes back to my statement earlier about this part of the project is why we can't have nice things like React. All of these packagers, even React comes with Create React App as a way to stand up a pre-built build framework for creating a React application, and that already has all of the Grunt tasks and Gulp tasks or whichever they're using in there, and doing all of the things for imports and everything else. So you don't even have to think about it. You can just go start writing code and throwing import statements in. And that's where if I could have used React, I would have done it. With Grunt, you could write all of this in Grunt yourself. You could. It would take more time. The nice thing about using Yeoman is even though it's using Gulp by default in here, there's Gulp is one version, Grunt's another one. Different people like different flavors for different reasons. You could use one of the builders that uses Grunt instead of Gulp. Generally speaking, Gulp is going to execute a bit faster, is my understanding from all of the reading that I did. And that generally seems to be where everyone's gone, because in terms of how you code the interaction between the plugins, it's got a slightly different model. At the end of the day, it's going to be which one gets you to where you want to be the easiest, or does the job that you want it to do the best. So I just recommend don't being married to one in particular. Before I got into doing React, at my previous job, I managed a team where we rebuilt our entire website using Angular. And at my job here, I was definitely all for going the Angular route again. But as we evaluated what we wanted to do in some of the bigger picture items and what the team wanted to learn, we decided to go with React. It's the same thing here. Gulp, Grunt, Yeoman, Webpack, whatever else you might want to use. Take a look at them and see what's going to be the solution that gives you what you want. Is it possible to store the map snapshot in the IDB? Wow, that's a really good question. I hadn't even considered that one. That really is a fantastic question. I would say maybe. I know that's not a great answer. I would say maybe you could. You definitely have to experiment with it a lot. I'm going to guess that there would be some caveats to it. Yeah, that's hard for me to say. I would say at the end of the day, if it's coming back, anything that's coming back as any kind of structured JSON data or something, you certainly could store. The image data and things, technically, I'm sure you could. You'd have to convert it into data blobs and then shove the blobs into the database and then pull them back out. That's going to be slow from a JavaScript operation standpoint. So you'd be trading off some performance, and I don't know that you'd really be saving anything on storage, because whether or not you're taking image data and putting it in the cache or putting it in IndexedDB, it's still going to take about the same amount of space, file size-wise, on the system. Let's see. Another question about maps. I know we're in the local host. The web data is stored. Okay. So, fair question. Let's look at applications real quick. So if you look in the application, yeah, you'll see I'm using 526 meg for the application. And a lot of that is going to be the maps data. No question about it. If you look in your cache storage, and you see all of these maps calls, and that's where a lot of your maps stuff is going to be. So yeah, it's just in your cache, and so you can find them in there. If you clear your cache, it's going to knock down a lot of that data storage, data usage. Same thing with looking at IndexedDB if you want to see what all your data is in there. And you can see, like I said, I'm storing these things as strings. Just make sure that you're storing and pulling using the same data type, so that you can get everything out. Do we have any other questions? My question backlog is empty, and we still have a few minutes left if you guys want to use it. Kelsey's been doing a great job keeping up with all the questions you guys have been putting out. Hopefully I've been covering everything that you guys were hoping we would hit on during the presentation. I know I spent most of my time talking about the Yeoman file. That really is where most of the effort's going to be in this particular project. And like I said, every one of them can be done differently. This is just how I did it. And I did just enough to get me where I needed to be. I'm sure it can be better than it is. But this did work. It got everything done that it needed to. You could certainly put things in here like image compression and the other topics I've seen people mentioning on the Slack channel. But you can handle your images differently as well. They don't have to be done through here. Like I said in the first presentation, I did all mine through Photoshop, and it got me the results that I needed. All right, give it another minute. So, okay, doesn't look like we have any more questions. I know we stayed a few minutes late. If there aren't any more questions, and if I've covered everything that you guys need, then I'm always one who's happy to give people a little bit of time back too, so we can end. We can go a few minutes short of the full 60. And I will be around on the Slack channels. I do kind of haunt the area there and try and pick up questions from time to time. I'm also still working on the Android Nano Degree program, so I've been putting a fair bit of time in there as well. So I'm not 100% active on the Mobile Web Specialist channel, but I do try and get in to look and see if people have questions. You can always send me a direct message if you need to. Oh, looks like we're getting a bunch more questions now. So I'll give a second for some of those to come through. See, yeah. Oh, yeah. Good point. Good point from Levi. Remember that if you're going to use Browserify, you have to Babelify it first. And that is an excellent point. Although I do recommend that you write everything in the project in ES6. And I think that's actually one of the things with Webpack. It might handle ES6 better. Okay, question about do I like React? We're getting a little off the topic, but that's fine. I'm good with that. Do I like React better than the newest Angular version? And did I do much of an evaluation? So the answer to that is I like React an awful lot. It is very flexible. It's very cool. The model is actually really, really nice. It's better than I had expected going in. I've done a little bit of evaluation on the new version of Angular, but not enough that I would say whether I like it more or less than React. So again, I'd say just do a little bit of research. If you put them head to head against each other in terms of what you can accomplish with both of them, they come out basically the same. But from a market standpoint, my team was more interested in doing React because they felt like it was a more marketable skill. So I was happy to give them that. Is this my typical real-world project? So I will tell you that my most recent real-world projects, the one that we're working on right now at my employer for Academy Sports and Outdoors, we are working on rebuilding Academy Sports and Outdoors website. It is definitely a larger scale website than this particular project that we did here. My previous one was for DSW shoes, and I did the same work there that I'm doing here. So the scale is larger, but a lot of the fundamentals are exactly the same. There still needed to be a grunt build and Webpack build and all these other things happening. Actually, there are a lot of other layers with the Academy Sports website that we're not covering here. I mentioned briefly in the first presentation about using a digital asset manager. That only scratches the surface on some of the larger architectural things that you can do in terms of UI, but fundamentals are all here. So definitely pay attention to what you've got going and you'll be good. Let's see. Hid your map key in a config file for GitHub. Will that cause review problems? I would say no, as long as you're calling it out in your README file and telling the reviewer what they need to do to make sure that they can use their map key. Am I saying that you don't actually need a gulp file? I'm not saying that. You're going to need some kind of build file here to be able to get the IDB import to work. If you don't have a build of some kind going on, then you are not going to get IDB to work out very well for you, or it's going to take you at least as much pain and effort as if you just get your build file done, whether it's gulp or grunt or whatever else. Let's see. It says that, okay, question about the images. It says I only have 2 resolutions created in the viewport, but I declared 3. That's a really good question. Let me go back because I am not remembering that off the top of my head. So I have banners and I have tiles. Oh, and then what these are just the original source images that came with the project. I left them here, but I'm not actually using them in the project anywhere. So good catch and good question. Let's see. And after changing the, and just to be clear, for each of the images for banners and tiles, I do have single density and double density for each one. So I really am only using 2. I just kept the source around in case I needed it. Let's see. After changing the server to 1337, you successfully got restaurants, but images have gone missing. Oh, okay. That is a really great question. And you are right. I meant to call that out. If you look, let me find where I have it in here. Yeah, here you go. So you'll see that in the original data set, you had restaurant.photograph. In here, to your point, that data is not always there. So in that case, because I already know what I've named my images and what my naming scheme is there, I've said that if restaurant.photograph, if the photograph property is on the restaurant object, then I'll return an image URL based on that. If it's not, then I'll return an image URL based on the ID of the restaurant. So great catch. Thank you for asking that. I did mean to point that out earlier and skipped over it when we were reviewing the code. All right. I think we've got them all. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to DM me on Slack. I don't really get into the Udacity, the actual Udacity chat very often. I'm primarily on Slack. You can feel free to shoot me a message there. Happy to help answer any other questions that might be out there. And good luck, everybody. Have fun with the project.